Now, when you're looking at this, if I were to just come in and try to lay a piece of glass right on top of here without having any kind of a backer, that's going to be pretty difficult because once the glass is wetted out, it becomes very pliable. It's going to sag, and I'm going to end up having a little dimple on one side of this panel, and on the other side, I'm going to have a hump. Not cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a temporary backer, and for this, because it's relatively small, I'm just going to take some shrink wrap tape and tape over one side to close the hole over, flip the panel over, and then I'll lay in my first layer of top strand matting up against that. It'll just give me a nice contour or a nice backer to lay that first piece of glass on. I'm going to let that set up. Then at that point, the first layer of glass will be stiff enough that we'll be able to use that as, I guess, the backer for all of the rest of the pieces on both sides. And like I mentioned before, first layer that I'm going to be putting on here on both sides is going to be a single layer of chop strand matting. And with chop strand matting, rather than cutting it, I've mentioned this before in other videos, my preference is to tear it and not cut it. By tearing it, you get these nice little wisps that kind of hang off the end, and it just tapers off really, really nicely. So it saves some sanding time, I guess, down the road. So I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm just looking for a piece a little bit larger than the size of this hole. And again, none of this is rocket science. You can just eyeball it. And that's it. All right, so I'm going to mix up one very small batch of resin. I'm going to be using polyester laminating resin. There's a couple different types of polyester resins that you can get out there. Some are considered finishing resins, and the other is considered a laminating resin. The difference between the two is a finishing resin has typically a wax additive mixed into it, so that when you lay the material down, the wax floats up to the surface, creates an air barrier, which allows the polyester resin to fully cure. When you're using laminating resin, that doesn't happen. So it always stays tacky. It stays tacky for the next layer of glass you're going to be laminating. So and to be honest, I never ever use finishing resin. I buy laminating resin by the 5-gallon tub. And when I'm all done laying up my glass, when I need to seal it off to cure it, there's a number of different ways that you can do that, and we'll get into those a little bit later in this episode, and definitely when we start talking about gel coat. But for right now, just using this little brush, and I'm going to catalyze this resin with what's called MEK, or it's MEKP. It's methyl ethyl ketone with peroxide. And the mixing ratio, you want to catalyze your resin at about 1%. So what that boils down to is about 10 to 12 drops of hardener per ounce of resin. So we'll go ahead and we'll get this mixed up. We're going to wet out our surface, lay down our first layer of chop strand matting, wet that out, and then we're going to let that set up until it's set up. And then we'll keep moving. Now, after you've added your catalyst or your MEK, when you're stirring this, you should see the resin itself kind of change color a little bit. It should darken up. If it darkens up like right away, you mixed it a little too hot. And if it doesn't change color at all, well, then it's under-catalyzed, and it probably won't cure. So if you're seeing a color change after 5-10 seconds, that's about right. That's kind of what I usually shoot for. All right, and now with my cup, I'm just going to wet around the outside perimeter. Really just the area where this first layer of glass is going to be tabbing onto. So once the glass is down, then it's just a matter of coming over and wetting this glass out. All right. Well, it's been about an hour, and the first layer of glass is set up. It's not cured, but it's set up enough to, that I think it's set up enough to start pulling the tape off. Now, one thing that I did that I thought I was recording was when I laid up my tape on the backside, I actually tripled or quadruple taped this backside. The reason for that was that if I just did a single layer, the heat that's created when this resin is curing, it would have deformed the tape if it was just a single layer, and I would have been left with a nice, not so nice, hump on one side and a big dip on the other. So by layering this up 3, 4, or more layers, it just stabilizes everything, and then so that it cures flat. So let's peel this off to see how we really did. Hopefully the glass does not come up with it. I know I'm going to get asked this question, so I'm just going to answer it right now. I know that someone's going to ask, well, since I already had the backer, the tape on there as a backer, when I was laying up my first layer of glass, why couldn't I have just continued on and laid up all of my glass all at one shot? And on one hand, you'd think that, well, yeah, that just makes sense. But again, going back to the heat that's generated when this material is curing, if I had 3 or 4 layers of glass on here, no matter how many layers of tape I had on the backside for support, it would have gotten so hot that it would have puckered that tape, and it would have given me a really wavy texture, which, thinking I had 1 or 2 steps, it would have created more work for myself. Whereas this way, I was able to come in, lay down one single layer, and just walk away. I could do something else for an hour, come back, and I've still got a nice smooth surface. So now that I've got a rigid backer on here that I can essentially now lay up as many layers as I want, and it's not going to deform, that's going to be our next step. Well, sticky.